Okay. Now, do you have your notebooks out? I have people telling me they remember temporarily what was said, and then they forget it 5 minutes later after it was fully impressed upon their thinking, and then they can't remember the understanding that they gained from the lecture. So get this down on paper so that you can understand the psychological aspects of body electronics related to one of the major problems that all of us will be confronted with. Now, this is heavy-duty material. We talked about desire. We talked about desirelessness. And we talked about the incorporation of this particular duality into our consciousness, that we're able then to overcome those things that we have created which holds us in continual bondage. We've talked about this. Now I'm going to go into a two-pronged direction that goes clear back to the very beginning of time as far as we are concerned as a living entity, as a living being. Now, do you all have your notebooks out? Okay, there are two pathways that we have been on from the beginning of time. And basically, it has to do with the element of control. Controlling the love or the attention of another human being. Controlling the communication or the acquisition of things which we have from the environment or from other living human beings. And we say living human beings because that is all that we can relate to at this point of time. Because at this point of time, there's only a handful of people that have had experiences where they can relate to other types of bodies and forms that we have all experienced from times past. Now, the first pathway is how we started from the beginning of time, where we desire control. That's the first pathway. Now, that's control over love, control over attention, control over appreciation, control over other people's attention and activities and so on, where we want to have control over their communication, over their love. We want people to love us. We want people's communication. We want their attention and so on. Okay? The second pathway that we have embarked upon, about 50% of the people desire control. The other 50%, roughly, desire to be controlled. Desire to be controlled. And so we have on this pathway, it is just as important to understand this, because on the first level, the desire to be controlled is where the people have created the desire to be responsible, the desire to be cause. The second pathway of control, which you'll get full understanding of this in Book 3 when you start to penetrate some of the concepts that are there at a very deep level. You'll have to concentrate on it. The second is the desire to be controlled, which is really a victim level, where the person is here concentrating on being the effect rather than being the cause. They're concentrating and resisting the concept of being the effect of the environment or the environmental conditions rather than being in control of the environmental conditions. In other words, you have your cause and effect. Some people are resisting cause and some people are resisting effect. And this attitude that we have in our consciousness determines the very direction that we move throughout eternity. And so some of us have to be in control, and others of us have to be controlled, where some people are victim makers and other people are victims. And this is where we have the cause and effect relationships going on between people. And when we get down to the bottom of it, we start having the codependency relationships between people. And when people's consciousness changes, then these codependency relationships are knocked completely out of kilter, and then water readjusts to its own level. Okay? Now, from desire, which we discussed, if we desire control, then we begin to manifest if we don't get what we want, which we talked about. In other words, if we desire something, that means we don't have it. And by the very acknowledgement that we don't have something, we create the external conditions which the environment or the universe around us will move with measured precision to make sure that we don't have that which we do not, or that which we do understand that we don't have. And therefore we desire it. Now this we discussed. And so therefore, the more that we desire something, the more we create resistance to not having something, which creates the conditions in our not having it. Therefore, we want it even more until we reach a compulsion of having to have it. And we call this then the enforcement of the desire. And we get into the concept, I must control. And this is a compulsion where a person has to be in control. Control of other people's love, control of their wealth, control of communication, control of different things, and they have to have everything under their thumb, so to speak. Now, if that does not happen, and the people cannot maintain control because other individual intelligences are expressing their particular individuality, then what happens is we reach a point where I can't control. I can't control other people's love. I can't control other people's communication. I can't control the acquisition of what I want. And the person reaches a point of apathy and goes down into unconsciousness regarding this sort of thing. And then everything becomes absolutely a reactive state where the person from the position of control, listen to my words. As you get into the understanding of these words, you'll understand it at a far deeper level when you go into it hologrammically. We become totally compulsive and reactive concerning control. And it becomes out of control situation where the universe then creates the resistances that we have covered up by more resistances, to where we're totally into a reactive, compulsive mood of desiring, enforcing, inhibiting control. And this is one pathway which will lead to the disintegration of the soul, because it is a continued resistance which we perpetuate, which will bring about complete identification with matter on this pathway, which will literally lead to the disintegration not of the body, but the actual disintegration of the soul. And we go into a state of what they call the second death. The first death is the death of the physical body that we identify with. The second death that we enter into is the death of the soul, which will take place over many, many millions of years as a person continues this pathway until they can reverse it. Okay, and the reversal will be the knowledge which you're obtaining from these classes. And then we can reverse this downward spiral into identification with matter by reversing it with the concepts of unconditional love and unconditional forgiveness on each little karmic event as it unravels itself, as the universe represents it for our inspection and our experience. Okay? I think we understand that. The second pathway toward the disintegration of the soul is starting from the initial space of time, where we follow a pathway where we desire to be controlled. We want to be taken care of. We want somebody to watch over us and nurture us and love us. We want people's love. We want to have that nurturing aspect of life, and we're hurt inside if we can't find that sugar daddy or that ever-caring mother. Now, this nurturing aspect of wanting to be controlled, the desire to be controlled, is where I jokingly say, possibly I'm on this pathway. You know, we take a look at where we are. Sometimes there's mixed pathways. But I never get lost. People tell me where to go. And that's a very comfortable aspect. That's a very comfortable aspect, because as long as Big Brother is there watching over, telling us what to do, and the state is in control and taking care of us, and as long as they give us a job and a place to stay and food to eat and so on, and the state takes care of us, you know. And then you have the bureaucrats who are very willing to be controlled and tell people where to go, how much to produce, where to live, where their home is going to be, how much to eat, and they parcel it out like little misers, you know. The bureaucrats will be on one end of wanting to control, and then you have other people who are perfectly willing to be controlled because they are secure in that particular aspect of having their whole life controlled for them. Now, let's see where we fit somewhere between these two extremes. And sometimes we don't have a black and white situation, but we'll have shades of gray in between. And maybe certain areas we do desire to be controlled, while other areas we exert our fierce independence. And these things will be areas that we'll have to consider carefully. But in the desire to be controlled, if we're not being controlled sufficiently, then we start to do what is necessary to get people's attention around us where we must be controlled. And here's where little children sometimes that are on this pathway are very, very happy when they're being disciplined and they're doing what they can to attract people's attention, so they will be controlled. And then they're content because they're being controlled, because control is equated oftentimes, somebody loves me because they're controlling me. And here's where we get into the equations of A equals A, where love equals control. And they feel if they're not being controlled, not being given the attention to and told what to do, then there's no love. Are you with me on this? Now, every single human being will have elements of both the control or the elements of being controlled. They'll have the elements of cause, they'll have the elements of being the effect. So we go from the element of must being controlled, which is enforced being controlled, where we'll do what's necessary to force others to exert their control upon us, where we have to be controlled. And then eventually we reach a point, if we fail in this endeavor, we then reach a point where I can't be controlled. And here's where people are so far out of control that they can't be controlled either by their own self or by other people. And here's where people become totally reactive. Now, when we analyze this in depth, carefully, and go deep into the psychology of the human mind, we find that we are basically on one pathway, on one pathway or another pathway. And each pathway, depending upon our continued resistance, will lead us down the pathway to the disintegration of the soul, which is the rejection within ourselves of our own God energy, the recognition of our own I am concepts that we have discussed, and by denying this particular aspect of our lives, we continue to look for solutions for control and for solutions to be controlled outside of ourselves, and we look for that solution there with our continued resistance to those factors until we literally become totally conditioned by the environmental circumstances around us, and at that time we become totally identified with matter, where we have no memory as to how we set up our own game plan. Now this becomes quite difficult, and it becomes quite difficult to resist these patterns. It becomes quite difficult to go through the concepts which cause us to be in this out-of-control situation in either aspect, okay? Because our memory is occluded by the resistance, the emotional resistance of pain that we have incurred by inflicting it on other people, which then boomerangs back on ourselves, or having it inflicted upon us, which then boomerangs back on ourselves. So all of these things here fit in together at a very, very deep level. Any questions here?
I have a question.
Doug.
Okay. I hear you relating this scale to the pathway of the dissolution of the soul or the second death. And so...
Both pathways.
Both pathways relating to that. So I'm looking at this, and I don't know if this is a good time to go into this or not, but I'm looking at this in terms of Chapter 29 there, and I'm wondering how this relates to the pathway of not giving up as opposed to the pathway of giving up.
I didn't want to bring that up now.
Okay, well, I didn't bring it up then.
So you bring it up. Stand up, Doug.
Well, I mean, I'd probably need to put a diagram on the board and all that sort of thing.
Nope.
Okay, well...
The diagram's in Book 3.
Okay, it'd be diagram 29-1. Bob's been playing with this one. I don't know the page number. Is it? 638. 838. Well, it doesn't matter. It's chapter 29, 29-1.
Which book?
Book 3.
Oh.
Okay. Okay, there's a situation that goes like this. If you look at the scale of emotions from enthusiasm down to unconsciousness, and you look at the amount of resistance that an individual will have, you typically are going to have, as a person falls from enthusiasm down to fear, and this is either resistance to yin or resistance to yang. You'll get the same thing either way. You're going to have a pathway of increasing resistance from enthusiasm down to fear. And this will involve, and this is again going in that direction from enthusiasm down to fear, this is going to involve an endothermic reaction, and it's going to involve an increase in complexity in the crystal formations within the body. So this is moving in an involutionary direction from enthusiasm to fear. Whether it's resistance to yin or yang, what you're going to have is an increase in resistance. You're going to have an endothermic reaction, which is exactly why when you're going back upscale, you get the exothermic reactions from fear up to enthusiasm, because it's a healing crisis. But on the way down, from enthusiasm to fear, you've got an increase in resistance, you've got endothermic reactions, and you've got basically a situation where the crystal formations in the body are getting more complex. More complex. At the point of fear, as we're moving down scale, there are two options that take place here. One is that, and this is what John's been referring to here, is a situation where basically the person hits a point of giving up or giving in to the resistance. And this is what John refers to as the pathway of the second death or the dissolution of the soul. And so this is where from fear down to unconsciousness, you'd actually have a disappearance of the crystalline formations, or shall we say a reduction of the crystalline formations, where they would get progressively less complex from fear down to unconsciousness, and you would actually have a situation where you would be having your exothermic reactions.
That's correct.
From fear down to unconsciousness, and when you get down to the point of total unconsciousness on this pathway, basically you have what John would refer to as the death of the soul, or the second death there, because the individual has ceased to. Basically, they've given up.
He's given up and he's given in.
Yeah, they've given up,
and he is totally the effect of the surrounding environment at that point of time.
So that's one possible pathway from fear down to unconsciousness.
They have denied their own godhood completely.
And this sounds what John. This is something that John was describing here a little bit this morning when he's talking about the second death. He's talking about the dissolution of the soul. And that's one of your alternatives from fear down to unconsciousness, is if you basically just give up, you're going to go exothermic on that pathway down, and the crystal formations in the body are actually going to get increasingly less complex, and you eventually get to the point where the second death takes place, and you're more or less recycled at that point. You get to a point where you're basically even the ego itself is disintegrated, and there's nothing left. The spiritual essence still exists, but the identity is lost.
The ego is not disintegrated. The ego, or the intelligence, as is the ego being synonymous with intelligence, that exists forever.
The personality.
But the energy field around that particular ego structure will be totally taken into a state of degeneration, where it breaks down, where there is absolutely no outer personality to that ego. That ego is stripped of all outer appearance as we would recognize it as a separate and distinct, unique personality. The personality is gone.
At that point, my understanding is that ego would more or less start over with a clean slate in a new reality. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, I have a question there then. If they master things in that reality, do they then have the opportunity to come back and resume that personality that's been scrapped and go through that, or is
not the same personality?
That's
no
lost
way.
forever.
That's gone forever. They come back with the beginning of a new slate of activity within a framework of a controlled framework, beginning with the mineral world itself, and moving gradually upscale, as has been defined in other teachings, from the mineral world on back up. But at this time, they are no longer one with us, and this is terribly disadvantageous to those people that are tied into that individual on a very high level of association. But they are destroyed, both body and soul, as we would describe it. Not the ego, not the intelligence, but the soul is the combination with the personality of the person. The personality is gone, and they have to start over from scratch.
As they move in an involutionary direction and disappear at zero resistance at unconsciousness, do they reappear at an infinite resistance in another reality?
They are reorganized at that time. They are reorganized within parameters of total restriction and control.
And then they settle out in the new reality.
And they settle out then in their new reality.
Okay, so we have that one alternative from fear to unconsciousness, where you give up and you give in, and you basically go down to the second death. But there's another alternative which I wanted to mention here.
You might say, Doug, it'll take people millions of years to reach this point of total disintegration. But by giving up and giving in, you're adding to that pathway.
You're moving in that direction whenever you give up.
That's correct. Continue on, sir.
Okay.
You continue on, Doug.
Okay. So there's another alternative here, which is this. You've moved in a endothermic reaction from enthusiasm down to fear, and
now stop. Get this. Picture it in your mind and get it.
Okay. In either case, you've moved in an endothermic reaction from enthusiasm down to fear, and you've moved towards a state of greater complexity in the crystalline formation and the crystal formations within the body. The one alternative that we've gone into here so far is the second death, which is where from fear down to enthusiasm, what would you have, endo or exothermic? You'd have exothermic, which means that the crystals are basically gradually disappearing. There is another alternative, which is where you don't give up and you don't give in, and it's what John would term one-pointed resistance. You don't stop resisting. You're still resisting because you're moving from, you're still continuing to move down towards unconsciousness, but rather than giving up or giving in, you really fixate on what you're resisting, and you just absolutely refuse to give up no matter what. You absolutely refuse to give in no matter what. And what happens here then is that as you move from fear to unconsciousness, you actually continue in a endothermic reaction. And the crystals actually continue to get more and more complex. And this is actually, if you get all the way up towards unconsciousness, you approach infinite resistance on this pathway, which is where you get the formation of a lot of your short-lived radioactive elements. You'll have to really get the diagram and read the book to really understand this, but there's a number of different types of time-space continuum warps that can take place, and this is the type that we're re-experiencing in a healing crisis in the visualization and consciousness courses. This is the one that a few people have gone through. But basically what happens is the body goes through a state of infinite resistance as a result of the total refusal to give up, the total refusal or the one-pointed resistance. And you actually go through a point of infinite... Well, you got to read the book there, Brooke. You go through a point of infinite resistance at the level of unconsciousness, as opposed to going down to zero resistance, which was the pathway of the second death. So what you're getting is a continual endothermic reaction all the way from enthusiasm to unconsciousness on this second pathway.
Let me just throw this out. You ready? Okay. At the fulcrum point, we then have the full development of the carbon atom. Okay, this is the fulcrum point.
At fear?
At fear. This is the full development at fear. Now, as you move above fear, from whichever direction or from whatever pathway that you have been working on, then the carbon atom itself becomes less resistance. The resistance is lost. The carbon atom sheds the melanin protein complex, which is the carbon hydrogen manifestation of the crystals. The crystals in the human body, which are carbon-based, become less consistent in their hold on the human frame, and these carbon hydrogen protein hydrocarbons, if I can call that, which hold the person as a organic computer chip full of stored memory, these literally begin to break down into lesser and lesser elements. Okay? The vibration of the human body begins to increase at this point, where the carbon elements begin to break down into the lesser elements. And the body becomes more mobilized, like we're going from a solid, fixated crystalline formation into more of a liquid and then eventually a gaseous type situation, where we move from, if we look at the physical reality, we move from a solid like a piece of ice into water, which is liquid, into a gaseous state, which is amorphous, so to speak. It's just not, it's not contained. It's just, it's there in the physical reality. The same thing is true in a spiritual reality when we take a look at that, because we're no longer bound into a solid state which controls our conditioned response reactive mechanisms. Now, there's two pathways, as I mentioned before. Just divide the periodic chart in half and you'll understand. One pathway, which is having to do with the one-pointed resistance pertaining to control, which is one of the major issues, which is associated with love, which is associated with communication, etc., etc., etc. Okay? This particular aspect of control, when we move through one-pointed resistance to the experience of wanting control and the other pathway of wanting to be controlled, will cause the creation of certain more complex elements, depending upon which in chemistry we have a valence concept. One will be on the left side of the periodic chart, and others will be on the right side of the periodic chart. And the pathway of consciousness will determine which elements will begin to come into manifestation by the one-pointed continual resistance, which you will not get where you give in and give up. This is where you continue to resist until you move clear up through the top of the periodic chart with all the short half-life radioactive elements, and you go pooping right through that from infinite resistance into a zero resistance, which will be a part of the Time Space Continuum Warp. Now, to be very frank with you, when you come back from zero resistance, which you'll manifest on a meter, which will control, which will be in your body, and you'll measure the resistance in your body as your mind controls what's happening on the body. At zero resistance, the body becomes a superconductor. At that point of time, you go from zero resistance for a period of time, and then you reappear at an infinite resistance, and you come back down through all of these things with all kinds of phenomena happening to your physical body and the surrounding environment for a period of time until you settle out in a new reality. And this is coming back from the downward spiral. We're coming back then into where we have overcome that particular problem. But that will only refer to those people who have never given in and never given up. And those are the only ones that will come back through that. And those are the people who are highly, highly competitive, where they refuse to give in to something that they believe in wholeheartedly, and their resistance mounts and mounts and mounts until they go through that particular time-space continuum warp, which will be rather disastrous to them as far as the body is concerned at that time. We're not going to get into that here. But when you come back the other way, you'll re-experience that whole thing, and you'll have memory coming back of having one time been terribly competitive and terribly resistant to the things of life. And that will be for those people who are on that pathway. Now, for the people who've gone the other route of resistance and giving up and giving in, which is the victim role, these people, when they go down and out, we cannot retrieve them because, how can we contact the spirit at the very level of their immortality, which now exists locked within the parameters of control of, shall we say, a piece of rock? And that's where they are. They're back down in the mineral kingdom, learning to be responsible for that which at one time they would not be responsible for, because they're always giving up and giving in and not overcoming and learning to overcome resistance by love or by other means at that time. So I just want to expose this concept to you, because the elements of the universe reflect the consciousness of man. Mother Earth is made up of the dust of this earth. Our bodies are made up from the dust of the earth, and as our consciousness changes, the very physical elements of our body go through tremendous transformation, and Mother Earth again reflects that. So it's not that Mother Earth is separate from ourselves. It's not that our bodies are separate from ourselves. We are all one. And when we understand this concept, we will understand that every single thought that we think will have an eternal reflection or outer manifestation of the inner consciousness, which is us, which we are as a God in embryo. I think I said enough, Doug. You go ahead.
Okay, I have a couple of questions. Would there then be, if you looked at the periodic table of elements and you looked at the diagram in terms of yin and yang, would there be a further division within the periodic table of those elements that were created as we resisted on the yin side versus the yang side?
Of course.
Okay. Then the other question I have is if a person were to go through the time-space continuum warp, well, really in either direction, but passing through a state of infinite resistance at one point, would this, if there was a Geiger counter handy, would this go wild there for a period of time?
I haven't ever done that.
But
because at the time that people have gone through the time-space continuum warp, we didn't have a Geiger counter on hand. We didn't expect it. It's when we don't expect these things, it's when they happen.
But theoretically, you'd probably get something even on a Geiger counter for a short period of time.
We've had very nice radioactive burns on clothing, on rubber gloves. We've had radioactive burns on tables, and we've certainly burned them through a few well-varnished walnut tables. I don't know the answer to your question, sir.
Okay.
We haven't put that to scientific test.
Should we get Wolf's question?
Wolf, are you ready for your question, sir? That's a different way of looking at it, isn't it? Are you ready for your question?
Yes. Well, I've got it written down. I mean, we have a free will to decide, for example, here, on which path we are going, or partly in between. But now what happens if this free will is destroyed, for example, if someone has an accident and then is a mental a case as such? I mean, which way will this person, this ego, this individual then go?
We're looking at short-term, only this life, when there's been thousands and thousands of lifetimes. And if we get checkmated, so to speak, on a chessboard this lifetime, then we dump this body and we go get another one and we start over. And that's part of the game of life. I beg your pardon? Louis, are you stretching or do you want to talk? You bring your chair up here. Well, don't run over anybody in the process. Matthew.
My question is on the second branch of the downward spiral that's characterized by never giving up. Does that drop out into the mineral kingdom also? I mean, what's the end result of that?
We haven't got there yet. I've still got to cover that.
Okay, but basically, any resistance that we have where we give up and give in puts us into starting over at the very bottom of the ladder.
Again, in the branch that is characterized by resistance, is that essentially the victimizer personality?
Yes, sir. But they don't have to be the victimizer. They're just simply not giving up and they're not giving in, which other people will naturally be victimized by that because they give up and they give in. Sama.
I'm wondering how, when a soul becomes disintegrated, you said the people who are linked to that soul at a very higher level, it's a great disadvantage to them, or disfavor or something. How are they really? I thought that once a soul is disintegrated, it's gone, and all its karma, everything is cancelled out. Then the people who were linked to that lineage, whether genetically or anything, they will no longer have any, they can carry on their own without having any direct resonance with that soul which is disintegrated, is it?
Have you read book 3? Read it. That's a question that'll take a long time to answer. I don't mean to be harsh on you on that. It's just that read it, study it, and then you'll come up with some questions that will really be deep and profound. Yes, sir.
You were talking earlier about infinite resistance at unconsciousness. Would there also, so that there is, am I correct in understanding that there's an infinite resistance at unconsciousness as well as the top end of the scale?
Yes, sir.
Is it the same resistance?
One is a one-pointed resistance, which will be explained in book 3, And the other is where you give up and give in, which is just, you just become the total effect of it.
He's talking about the other the one you don't get into about the infinite of enthusiasm.
I haven't got into that.
Will you do that, or is
No. Doesn't apply to us here. Okay? That's why I left that blank. I've only put in book 3 that which can apply to where we are at this point of time in existence. The other things that don't apply to us I left out.
Could you define what you mean by soul?
The soul is the combination of the ego, which is immortal in its nature, and the body and the morphogenetic field which make up the body. Now, when the body disintegrates, you still have the morphogenetic field there to a degree, which is impinged upon the spirit level, because that's the experience level of the being. When that's totally dissolved, that, let's say the personality of the person, which is an energy field, then all that's left is the ego. So the soul would be considered the body and the spirit combined of man.
So basically, on the pathway from fear down to unconsciousness, you have this possibility of one-pointed resistance where you don't give up and you don't give in. And what happens if you continue on that pathway long enough, as you move towards unconsciousness, in other words, as you keep refusing to give up and refusing to give in, and the resistance just keeps mounting and increasing, you eventually get to a point of infinite resistance. And this is passing, and what happens at this point is you pass through a state of infinite resistance. This is in a involutionary direction. You pass through a state of infinite resistance, and then you actually reappear in a different reality where you basically get to start out at zero resistance again, and then you more or less kind of normalize or stabilize at an appropriate level of resistance within those new parameters.
But you have those parameters which will be part of that invisible prison with invisible bars from which we cannot escape, because that resistance will definitely be there until we overcome it. And when we overcome it, we are then freed from those parameters of that jail that we have imposed upon ourselves in prior existences.
As I understand it, what happens is, as I understand it, what happens is it's more or less a step of mercy, because you couldn't continue to exist at that point of infinite resistance. You would destroy yourself. So what's basically,
and everybody around you.
So what's basically happening is you're getting sort of shunted off to a more restricted reality with more restricted parameters in that reality, where you have the opportunity to deal with things in a more constructive fashion, and that which you've resisted in the past with that one-pointed resistance is temporarily held in a state of abeyance. In other words, you don't really have to deal with it yet. You master this new reality, and if you're able to do that sufficiently, this is where you eventually can get the opportunity to return to the other reality. And
in the same body, in the same space.
And this would be passing through the Time Space Continuum Warp, going back to the reality that you've left behind. This is the type of Time Space Continuum Warp that John's been referring to in the books, and that a number of people have passed through. It's a healing crisis. I mean, if you're passing through a Time Space Continuum Warp in this, what would now be an evolutionary direction, it's important to understand that that's an indication that at one time or another in your existence, you've passed through need a fly swatter here. You've passed through a time-space continuum warp in an involutionary direction.
I wish to say this much on that. Go get it, Doug.
Got a little one-pointed resistance here. There we go. Oh.
You let him go.
Yeah.
You've lost your spirit of competitiveness.
I've relocated him to somebody else's reality. So, Rex?
I'm just working on trying to get a picture of this, and So we're talking about an expanded awareness, like an expanded concept. And so on at this one-pointedness is you have to let go. If you keep resisting, you have to let go of that option, and you revert to another option.
You reach a point through your resistance where it becomes so compulsive you can't let go.
Okay.
That's where Doug has said that it is an act of grace. Now, you haven't given up the ship yet because you still acknowledge that, there's still some life left in you. You haven't sputtered out with a wimp and a tear. You're still right there resisting right to the very end. And so you still got some God energy left in you, which is going to be recycled now.
Okay. Yep, that's good.
Go ahead. You haven't denied the God within you yet.
Okay.
When you're fully resistant.
Okay.
On one hand you have, but on the other hand you haven't, because there's still life in the old bird.
Okay. And so to resurrect that again, I'll have to go away and think about it. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Keith.
But I was just thinking, you've actually got to not give up. You've got to actually not give up to the challenges that come to you in life. But on the other hand, you've actually got to give up to the God part of you.
Yes,
at the same time. So
but in the meantime, you don't give up and you don't give in. At the same time, you yield totally to obedience to law and principle.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
You do both at the same time.
So you get a balance between.
Now, a lot of people who are quite yin, they give up to God, and then their own fight, their own drive is gone.
Yeah, they just say, "I'll sit in a corner and let
they sit in a corner with a tear in their eye and a whimper, and they die.
They wait for something to happen.
Okay, yeah. That's what I don't want you to do. I want you to never give up and never give in, no matter how bad conditions are.
Oh, that's clear. Yeah, that's fair.
So basically on this pathway, on the way down, what's happened is you've passed through a state of infinite resistance, and then through basically a step of grace, you've been allowed to reappear at zero resistance prior to stabilizing within a new reality. If you reverse the process and go back in the evolutionary direction, what will happen is this: you'll be working through all of your different dualities, all of your different resistances, and you'll find that there will be dualities based upon dualities based upon dualities, much as you would have in a geometric proof. How many people took geometry at some point in the past? You know how when you make a geometric proof, you're building upon prior conclusions and prior things that you've proved? But if you trace it back far enough, there's certain things that are just accepted without proof within geometry, because you have to accept certain things without proof so you have something to build upon. What you have in your own mind really is a situation that goes much like this. There are some fundamental laws of the universe that apply to all of us. And what has happened to many of us at some point or another is we've fallen into a state of compulsive obedience to a particular law, where we have reactively identified with a certain law, and that which is John would say would be a compulsion. So in our own mind, we're always going to behave in a certain manner in accordance with this one law, and what you will then have built up from that pattern, and that resistance is what John would call truth versus resisted truth.
Which is a mental resistance, not necessarily an emotional resistance. You must separate the two resistances one from the other.
And this type of pattern will have an incredibly strong hold on the individual, because what you basically have is a compulsive virtue. By identifying with the law of the universe on a compulsive level, you are always going to be behaving in accordance with that law. So from your own perspective, as well as basically from other people's perspective, this is not going to be seen as a weakness. This is not going to be seen as a flaw. This is not going to be seen as a problem. It's going to be seen as a virtue, which is what makes it so terribly difficult for an individual to unravel this, because there doesn't appear to be a lot of feedback from the universe that there's even anything to change there. This is something you like about yourself. This is something that other people like about you.
The difficult part to see about this is this virtue that you consider is only your truth. Okay, somebody else might have a different truth, which they consider to be a virtue, and be in the same situation, which may be diametrically opposed to the truth that you have accepted and resisted. And so this truth will vary from one person to the next, because it is what has created universal laws is universal agreement upon those laws. And that universal agreement in one part of the universe may be different than universal agreement in another part of the universe. And so when you have people from different parts of this portion of the universe in these carbon-hydrogen bodies together, one person may have what we would call a Time Space Continuum Warp concept, which would diametrically oppose the next person's, because the truth for them will vary. And that's one of the problems we take a look at. Some people say, well, my truth is different than your truth, and that's true. And we get back into the time-space continuum warp, and you can see the compulsive aspect, how one person is compulsively acting on their resisted truth, while Doug, for example, will be dealing from his resisted truth. And the two are diametrically opposed to each other.
Rex?
Come up here, sir.
Okay, so does that friction that's caused through those two diametrically opposed points create another problem? Is that like who lets go? What in that position?
It creates adversaries in this lifetime.
Okay.
Because you multiply that many times going down scale, and the pathway that one person takes will be diametrically opposed to another person's pathway, and they become enemies, not being able to see eye to eye on anything.
Okay. So then you say to love your enemies and to be... The conclusion of that is it dissolves it, does it? Or what are we... Where are we going then when you have two diametrically opposed opinions or points, and then you love them unconditionally? If one doesn't love unconditionally, it becomes superior and it controls.
That's right.
Okay, so we're back to that again.
Yep.
Oh.
And that is where the prime emphasis comes from. Control in communication, control in love, control in things. Okay? You got it? Continue on, sir.
So
Matthew, come up here, please.
Matthew always stands up with such strong intent when he wants to ask a question.
And then he turns and sits down again.
So my question involves coming upscale with an individual, a personality that is, say, down at level 7, who is the highly resistant type that doesn't give up. Is he going to have then show a different kind of fever as he goes through the healing crisis, moving up scale?
Everything will be different. And here's where two people start out together in life's patterns, or even a group of people start out, they're all equal. They're what you call equally yoked. Okay? And then what takes place at a later time, if one person is continually working to discipline himself or herself to move forward in life, and really move forward in life from a position of integrity and intent, then those two people become unequally yoked, and oftentimes in that relationship they will split because there's nothing holding them together except a rubber band that just broke, because one has moved very rapidly upscale and the other has refused to move because they have continued to be in a position of being reactive in their behavior mechanisms. And this takes a great deal of discipline and a deep control so that we eliminate. Give those to Anita, if you would, please. Thank you very much, Christabel. Those are very much needed. Anita will be busy the next 2 days. Now, I hope you're with me on this. The thing is the concepts of one person changing in consciousness, they're not going to be leaving other people. They're going to be incorporating other people. But if you're in a church, what happens? The church kicks you out and you get your graduation papers. If you're in a group of people that no longer accept you because of your weird ideas, they boot you out. And it gives you a chance to find new friends because of the changes that you have made in your mentality. The same thing will happen in a family. The same thing will happen in a marriage. Okay? People can't stand you anymore and they have to leave. Now, a person who is capable of incorporating and encompassing, they encompass, they don't leave. But they're usually kicked out, rejected, left by the group of people, excommunicated from your churches, and so that you have then the chance to grow. Because you don't think the way they think anymore. Now you remember this. A person who's godly incorporates. He doesn't leave. But a person who is ungodly will boot out anybody that differs from them in their opinion. You can take a look at the acts of people, and by their actions ye shall know them. Okay, any questions here? Lewis, come up here, sir. Please obey speed limits.
Okay, resistances are based in judgment. Are judgments then based in the truth resisted truth?
No. Judgments will be based upon a prior duality. And there may be 50 dualities in linear lines, so to speak, or holographic concepts if you want to look at it from that position. But from a logical point of view, there may be one duality that we encompass, which then opens up to our awareness, another duality that we encompass, which opens up to another duality which we encompass, and there may be 50 of them before we get to the Time Space Continuum Warp.
But are they ultimately rooted in the truth resisted truth, even if there's 50 or 100 or however many?
Yes. At that time, then you're free of judgment patterns which govern and direct our lives, because we think we make our own choices. But our own choices are oftentimes determined by choices that we've already made, that we have forgotten about.
Okay.
So we're programmed to make the choices we make, thinking we have free agency.
As you were talking earlier, when someone goes down the involutionary spiral to a certain point where they have to be recycled and they come back in another reality.
Yes, sir?
As you're going up the evolutionary spiral, it's kind of a two-pointed question at least here. Okay, as at the level of the monopoles, as someone goes through the time-space continuum warp, you reach a point of infinite resistance and then zero resistance. Is that correct? Okay, but going through the time-space continuum warp,
you go to zero resistance and then you reappear at infinite.
Okay, right. But I understood that the resistance is increased as you're going upscale until you hit that point.
That is on the one-pointed resistance.
Okay. So then as you go through the time-space continuum warp at zero resistance, you return at an infinite resistance?
Yes, sir.
At a different reality?
No, in this reality. Same body, same space.
That doesn't...
On the way back up, because again it is a healing crisis, you're going to go back through the zero resistance first, which is where you'll be a superconductor. Then you're going to reappear at infinite resistance. You're still in the same body. You're still in the same life. But what happens is you've basically totally shifted the parameters of your universe because you've removed that entire that truth-resisted truth no longer has a hold upon you.
You have let go of that resistance that has held you in bondage.
And thousands upon thousands of dualities that were all based upon it have all disappeared as well. So you're
and
still
you might spend 2 years going through those, one right after the other, as you reorient yourself to your new environment.
I'm still a bit unsure about when you come back at infinite resistance. Is that just the infinite resistance left over from everything that wasn't transmuted as a result of the truth-resisted truth?
In that area, yes. In that one segment of the pie.
You don't stay at infinite resistance very long, but it's a healing crisis, so you go through reverse order. So you go through 0 on the way back up, then you reappear. See, you have a normal resistance in the human body that we've talked about, where it would be roughly 5,000 in a woman or 12,500 in a man. And what's going to happen is your resistance is your measurable resistance with a good meter is going to drop down to 0, totally disappear to where you're a superconductor, but it's not going to go down to 0 and then sort of move back up to sort of a normal level of resistance. What's going to happen instead is it's going to go down to 0 and then all of a sudden instantaneously reappear over at infinity and come back down to where it's supposed to go. So as John says, you basically go through 0 and come out the other side. Or another way of saying it is you basically pass through a moment where you're simultaneously at 0 and infinite. But you don't stay at infinite very long. Then you re-normalize within your new parameters, but it's still the same body in the same lifetime.
Let's look at it this way. You're dealing with a series of coils and Mobius strips. And when you can put those together, you'll understand that. I haven't been able to get a real good model of it yet, but I have it up here.
One thing on this too, Lewis, as far as looking at these different dualities, during the course when I went through this experience, one of the things that we were doing is we were keeping, like, whoever was facilitating us was writing down our word patterns for us and writing down the different resistances that we were hitting. So
Doug could hold his body still.
Right. So you have a note, so we would each have a notebook, and there would be hundreds and hundreds of different word patterns in those notebooks, and each one of which would be related to some duality or another where I would have had resistance. One of the things that I was very struck by was that after I went back through the Time Space Continuum Warp, I looked through the notebook and just looked through page after page after page of word patterns. And one of the things that I was really struck by was well over half of those word patterns were they no longer applied. There wasn't anything left of them. So it made me realize what a process of excavation the whole thing had been, because you had, it wasn't just hitting one particular word pattern that was your Time-Space Continuum Warp. It was getting, and of course it's not just word patterns anyways, it's the emotions and the memories and everything that go with it, but you had to peel off a tremendous amount of other dualities. As John was saying here, you got to peel off one duality in reverse order to see the one that's based on, to see the one that's based on, and on and on and on, and it's an incredibly complex thing. But when you finally hit pay dirt, all of a sudden just many hundreds of dualities will just drop away just like that, and all the baggage that goes with them. All the memories, all the resistances that go with each one of those dualities just disappears all at once. And that's why, as John said, it might take a person quite a while to sort of get things back together in their world, because everything is shifted. Because if your thinking has changed that much, then it sometimes takes a while for the physical universe to catch up. Things need a while to sort out.
Let me unload. I don't talk about personal situations, because if I talk about personal situations, I can very easily influence other people to feel, well, that's them. But there are certain areas where there's a certain commonality. And I want to bring one particular time-space continuum warp out that I went through personally. I went through 4 different time-space continuum warps. My whole life just transformed. The one word pattern which has started out, which was very real to me, which I'm hearing many of you on the table, where I can't do what I want to do, I can't be what I want to be, I can't have what I want to have. And this is getting into areas of having things of a physical nature around us, where we're focused on having, which then controls our doing, where we have to have things a certain way before we can do what we want to do. And then this controls our doingness, so to speak. And then we have to do what we want to do before we can be, but yet we feel that we can't be what we want to be. And I've heard some of the people on the table, well, I can't be what I want to be. And this is the beginning. Now let's say this is one resistance. I can't be what I want to be because Mother won't let me do this, or Dad won't let me do that, or I can't do it in school, or I don't have the money, and we have all kinds of other interrelated thought patterns with that. I can't be what I want to be. And then gradually, when we start sorting through the word patterns, we get into something similar to this. I can't be myself. How many of you have felt that way? I just can't be myself. And that's a good number of you, because I've heard this on the table with a good number of you. That's why I'm bringing this one out. Then we reach a point when we get through the emotions and we look at it very carefully. The word patterns, I can't be myself, I can't be what I want to be type of thing, I can't be myself. And we reach a point then when we go in further, and I don't want to guide you or to influence you in any way on this. I'm giving you an example, because each of us will have a different entry phrase that will be meaningful to us, that we will have a memory of within a framework of reality and certainty. Okay, and we move into that word pattern, which is I can't be. I can't be. And the thought I can't be is a denial of our beingness. And this is where we will end up dealing with, I just can't be. And therefore, everything that we do is controlled by somebody else, because we're in a victim role, because we're being controlled, so we're fighting for our own survival here. I can't be. I can't control myself. I can't be myself. I can't think. I can't. And we're tied up with this, which will be at the bottom level, where we can't do things, and then we have to do things later on. We get into that, and then then we can be what we want to be. And we desire this and desire that, and we get trapped in the world of desire. But remember, in reverse order, we originally, every eye right here, please, we originally got caught in the world of desire, and then we got into enforcing that feeling, and then we reached a point where we inhibited that feeling, where we can't. So what I'm trying to point out, without damaging any of your individual progress by your own self-discovery of your own word patterns, is we start out at the bottom somewhere where I can't be myself. Well, look at the doing, look at the having, look at the things you don't allow yourself to have, look at the things you don't allow yourself to do with word patterns of this kind. Watch it very carefully, and then gradually, as you unravel and go through the feelings of identifying with and releasing one duality, and then the next duality, and then the next duality, eventually something will appear which will be very, very meaningful, that you know has affected your entire life, and this is what you look for. Okay? And that will be, I can't be. I can't be myself. I can't be. And we realize that, we felt that way all of our lifetime. We can't be. We can't be who we want to be. And that word pattern can take a number of different ramifications or reflections. And then finally we get back to, after we get into our I can't be, and then we get into a real struggle, I have to be myself, and all the emotions connected with that. And then we get into I desire to be. But what does desire to be have within it? That we don't have it. We don't have it yet because we want to be. But yet, we're denying our beingness by the very desire that we want to be. And so we have to look at that aspect, and it takes a tremendous amount of introspection and understanding of how the human mind works in this area to see how we've trapped ourselves. And then suddenly we just recognize, I am. And because the word I am turns so many people off, is because there is so much resistances to identifying with oneself. And this is where a lot of people get all upset when you start talking about I am. They can't handle it because there's so many resistances to their affirming, shall we say, their own godliness, because there's so much resistance that enters in there where they have denied their own I amness. And this, therefore, all the word I am, as soon as you mention that, a lot of people go, grunt! They get all this pain inside of them, or emotional pain, or denial, and because they cannot accept themselves as who they are, which is a immortal, intelligent being. Because they have denied that in themselves for so long, with so much hatred and so much resistance, that they can't handle it. Are you with me on this? Okay, now you keep that in mind. And so they're always trying to find some way around the fact that every single human being is a God in embryo and hasn't discovered it yet for themselves through self-discovery or what we'll call self-realization. Are you awake? Christopher, are you awake? Good. You've got it. He's processing. Okay, Doug, your comment, sir.
Well, I really actually started this whole thing off as a question, but I wanted to just relate. I wanted you to relate this whole thing of control. I must control. I desire control. I must control. I can't control, and desire to be controlled, must be controlled, can't be controlled. You originally were relating that the whole resistance around the issue of control to the second death pathway. And I was hoping you could relate it as well to the one-pointed resistance pathway.
You just did.
Well, I must have missed it. Well, I just mean, let me just ask you this. Are you still going to go, as you move from fear down to unconsciousness on the path of one-pointed resistance, are you still going to go through the state of inhibition, the I can't control or the I can't be controlled? Because that sounds an awful lot like the giving up portion of it.
You're not giving up. You're becoming compulsively more and more in control, where you reach a point where if I can't control, then I will destroy. I didn't want to get into that.
You'll destroy what you can't control.
You destroy what you can't control. And if do you know people? Anita here has the intention to speak to us. Stand up, dear.
Just one little line. Murder is the ultimate control. Murder, when you think about it, it's the ultimate control.
Just think about it. That's true. Yes, sir? Let me go at this another way. I hope your notebooks are going to be ready on this one. Now, I've never talked about this to my knowledge openly. If I have, you remind me. Another Time Space Continuum Warp is around the area of creation. Have you ever seen a little child out on the beach where they build this beautiful, beautiful sandcastle, and after they built the sandcastle, what do? They kick it down. You ever seen that? Have you ever seen people who build beautiful businesses and suddenly they go out and deliberately destroy their business? They wipe it completely out where it becomes a total shambles? Have you seen people in marriages where they've got a beautiful marriage and then they go out and totally destroy the marriage? And they don't know why. It's just beyond their total control. Present company accepted. We've all been there, one way or the other. In marriages, in economics, in politics, in any type of things that we have created. Okay. Let's talk about creation for a few moments. And let's start with, I desire to create. So we have a desire then to create. And that means if we want to create something, what does that mean? That we don't have it. And therefore, if we don't have it, we feel we want to create it. So we have something. And so what is the initial thought process that cultivates our entire thinking? Lack. So every time we are in a creative mode, one pathway is coming from a lack. There's also another pathway which will be for constructive purposes, where we're involved in creating for a good cause. But still, if we're coming from a position of lack, which most of us in our reactive modes are coming from, we go out here and create something because we want it. But underlying all that, what is there? That we don't have it. And so what's the universe going to respond to? Our underlying belief pattern that we don't have it. So we end up dealing with something that's out of our control, where we want something, and then the resistance of the universe starts giving us opposition, and we have to go out here and force the issue to create the issue of the thing that we want. It becomes very hard because we have all this opposition that we didn't really intend to have, because we want this so bad, and everything goes wrong, and we force the issue through until we have created what we want. But what's the underlying factor that we've never dealt with yet? That we didn't have in the first place? What's the universe going to provide? A means of destruction. And it's going to be just like absolutely computer clockwork. It's going to be taken away from you because you don't have what you thought you had, whether it be a marriage, whether it be a business, whether it be a position, whether it be an acceptance of responsibility somewhere. If you desire it, under that desire is the seeds of its own destruction. So you get into a word pattern like this. Every time I do something, it's wrong. And then we perpetuate that. Yeah, how many of you have ever felt that way? No matter what I do, it ends up in a disaster. Raise your hand. And we do it. And we do it perfectly. And so how can we judge people when they're absolutely manifesting their godlike thought patterns perfectly and creating chaos for themselves? How can you judge them and get upset with them? They're doing it perfectly, whatever they're doing. And this is why we don't judge. We just say, that's the way it is, let's take it from here. Look at it. Because we are the victims of our own thought patterns that we don't understand. We're the victims of our own desires, where we don't understand that the very thing we desire the most is the thing that we're going to destroy the fastest. if we're on that pathway. There's two pathways now. There's one where you're dealing from a non-reactive point of view. You're not coming from lack. You're coming from the ability to manifest, and that is where you're letting go of your creations, where you can have it or not have it, but you're still holding that ever-present in your mind without resistance. That's another matter. But that's not going to bother us because we can't do that yet, because we haven't got, for the most of us, we don't have the ability to visualize because we're trapped in our own karma. That we lend so much attention to by our resistance that we're really not able to be creative at this point of time. And those of us who think we're creative, we're just playing out old tapes. We're programmed to create the way we're creating on old tapes, where we're not truly capable of creating because our ability to visualize is not there. Yes, sir?
It would seem then, from what you're saying, that the list would be an ideal tool in this area, because we're going to not create karma, and we're going to be not creating any more karma, cleaning up the karma that we've already created, building on success upon success, and then not getting ahead of ourselves and having something be destroyed because we already have it to begin with.
I've got goosebumps all over me. The guy understands it. The list is the most important thing that you can involve yourself in. Now, I say this very gently, I say it very quietly, I try to be persuasive about it, about how important the list is. This is the most important thing you can involve yourself with because it frees us of our karmic considerations. Say it again, sir.
From what you just stated, then, so that we don't create something that we then destroy, if we use the list properly and resolve the karma we've already made for ourselves and not create any more karma, build success upon success, then when we do create something, it will be using desire and desirelessness and doing it so that it's for the highest and best good within a framework of reality and certainty, and therefore not destroy the things that we've created.
That's exactly correct. Spot on. Now let me say one more thing here. Every creation, by the very fact that we are in the material universe, is the material universe, does it have built within it duality? There is nothing in the physical universe that is not subject to duality. And therefore, you have within your Hindu scriptures, you have your creation, you have your survival, and you have your destruction, and then an element of rest. And I think they call it, what's the creation called? Brahma. What's the one called for survival? Shiva. And what's the destruction called? Vishnu. Is Shiva destruction? Okay, then it's Brahma, Shiva, Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva. There you have it. Okay? Now, when you understand this, the concepts that are taught in other philosophies or other religions, we understand that you have your creation aspect in every aspect of life. And with that, you have your duality. Because if desire enters into creation, we're in trouble. And so we have to have that desirelessness to control our desire. That goes back to the list again. Now, the same thing is true with the survival aspect of it. A lot of people are hung up where they can't create, or they can't continue on with something after they have created it, or they can't destroy it. And so you have many people that have the townhouse in the middle of the city that's been there for 300 years, that the rodents have got to very well, and the termites have destroyed, and yet don't tear down our heritage. And the people are out here wanting to pour millions of dollars into a restoration project rather than just tearing down that old building and get to it. And the moment that I say, oh, tearing down that old building, well, that's history and that's part of the past. You can't do that. And so they spend their entire life preserving that which has been created because they can't see anything destroyed. You've got to hang on to it. You ever seen people who can't get rid of things, and everything that comes, they collect string, and they collect rubber bands, and they collect toothpicks, and one thing or another, and they have tons and tons stuffed away in boxes here and there, because someday they might use it. And they never do. And they certainly can't give it away and get rid of it, because, oh, this stuff is valuable. You ever see a junk man? His prize collections are those things from the 1920 vintage Ford, that have rusted away nearly entirely because somebody might need this sometime. And there's piles and piles of junk that are his prized possessions. But he doesn't see them corroding away, having lost their usefulness. But he hangs on to it desperately because he can't destroy something. He has to hang on to it. Okay, how many of us are in this, I can't destroy, I can't get rid of things, I can't change things? Then we get into the other aspect of it. Once you get something going, it has to go that way forever, and you can't change it. Okay? And so you have to keep everything running perfectly, and if somebody does something a little different than that which has been done over the last several years, or what Grandpa has established in his day, if anything changes, oh, you can't change that. And oftentimes we're stuck in a situation where we can't change tradition, we can't change culture, we can't change belief systems, we can't change thought patterns, we can't change the food that we eat, we're stuck to a regimen, we have to do our exercise at 6 o'clock every morning, and it has to be for an hour and a half, and we have to do our spins 21 times to the right every single time, and we have to do it right, and we go on where we can't change. Now, I want you to look at the word patterns and how this fits our personalities, because all of us are into that. And then we get into creation, where we think, and this was my thought pattern, that every creation must have a destruction. Oh, every creation must have a destruction. And so how did I get around that? Because I didn't want anything to be destroyed. I had such a resistance to any form of destruction. I had resistance toward warfare. I had resistance to hurting anything living. I didn't want anything hurt or destroyed. I just didn't. So what did I do on every single creation which I did? I botched it up to start with, so there's always something wrong, like down in the corner of a little page I'd leave something unfinished. So I would never feel like I created something, because it was always left unfinished. And therefore I felt good about that. I would get it just about done, but I'd always find a reason not to finish it. And so for the first number of years of my life, I never finished anything. What do you think came caving in on me when I went through the Time Space Continuum Warp on every creation must have a destruction, and I recognized my whole life flitting before me? Every single thing that I had never finished, 200 items to be exact, it might be 202, phone calls, letters on things that I had never completed, came converging on me every direction, where I was forced, out beyond my choice, to complete. It took me 2 years on one thought pattern, one duality, one time-space continuum warp. And my whole lifetime just went through total transformation, because from that time on, I found I had to complete everything. Now, after I had taken responsibility for completing everything, then what happened? I had an experience where I was taught the list and the importance of the list, and how we can go through that list very assiduously, one thing at a time. It'll force us into our dualities as we look at the thought patterns and the emotions which are holding back our progress. And we move right into and up to the time-space continuum warp, where with a little bit of added effort we break right on through that. Now, Doug did the list very assiduously. I didn't. I didn't understand that. I was forced into doing my list. But it took me many, many months of concentration before I was able to go through and understand the anatomy of the time-space continuum warp. It took me agony of months and months to understand how this worked, because I had to come from no understanding at all of it. And this is, I've done a lot of research on the Time Space Continuum Warp. And there's a lot of people out there who badmouth me, who write in articles and so on, alleged Time Space Continuum Warp, and they claim that it didn't happen to Doug. They claim it didn't happen to me. It's all figments of our imaginations and all this sort of thing. But I want you all to know that as far as the mind-body relationships are concerned, the time-space continuum warp is the most important concept of our day. But we have to let go of the vestiges of barbarism that are incorporated into our thinking, that we might earn the right to enjoy the end result of this. It's going to take a little time, but the thing is we have to let go of those things, I'll use the word unholy desires, which have literally activated our lives and destroyed us in many respects, because we have done those things in our lives which are involutionary in nature, and put ourselves into a oftentimes into a very difficult position where we cannot see the forest for the trees. We cannot see the brightness of the sun at noonday, because we have created a condition wherein our eternal blackness of our mind has been activated over many, many eons of time by our collective resistances. And these hold us in a state of continual bondage. So these things I just feel very strongly about. I hope I'm not boring you silly. Some people said, John, get on with it. Forget these little lectures and one thing or another. Let's get on with the body work. I'll tell you this much. You're missing the whole boat if you're trying to heal the body without healing the mind first. And you as instructors have the responsibility of helping people understand the human mind and how it operates, so that when they get into the body work, they'll know what to do with the stuff that comes out of the tissues in the way of memories and emotions and word patterns that most people haven't got the foggiest idea to know what to do with. Even after point holding, they're sitting there with stuff that they don't know what to do with. And they justify themselves in their feelings and their emotions and say, well, I feel that way. But they don't know that that's part of the bondage that has taken care of them for lifetimes. And lifetime after lifetime, they make the same mistakes over and over again, and they don't learn their lessons. Now, this is where it is, folks. Doug.
Well, I think when we look at all of these principles that we're describing, that one of the things that I think we all need to recognize first and foremost is that the one person on earth that we really need to apply these to most is ourselves. And one of the things that I see a lot is that when people hear certain principles, they immediately start to apply them to everyone else in their life, and they immediately start to direct their attention towards everyone else.
And their conversation follows that. It's always what the other person should be doing. It's always justification for their own feelings, and it's always what the other person should be doing, what mother should be doing, what father should be doing, what the kids should be doing, what the mate should be doing, or the mismate, what they should be doing. And they don't take a look at their own garbage because their focus is always upon their resistances. Hey, Doug, repeat that again in your own words, and I want you all to listen, because this is one of the glaring problems that we have in our time, and it's right here among us.
Well, I've spent a lot of years listening to John lecture, and I've seen a lot of situations where John's been lecturing on a particular point or principle, and there'll be certain people or persons in the course who will take very, very great offense, and they'll be very, very mad at John, and they'll say, you were talking to me there, or you were getting on my case about something, or you were doing this and that and the other thing. And what I've seen over the years is half the time, John didn't have the slightest idea about any of the stuff that this person's getting all upset about. And the thing that I've noticed over the years is that if I just sit there and listen to John talk about different principles and different glitches in people's computers, is that if I'm honest with myself, practically every single thing he says applies to me. I mean, in other words,
I think that might be true, Doug.
Yeah, but so I'm just saying I'm just saying the point in all of this is it's very, very non-productive to spend all your time worrying about what everybody else should have done or would have done or could have done. You won't get anywhere that way. You'll never understand anybody else's mind if you don't bother to try to understand your own first. And so to me, it's like when we hear all these different principles, the person that we have to apply them to is ourselves. And it's, again, it's very, very non-productive to try to worry about what everybody else is doing or what they should have done or could have done or would have done. Start closer to home and just see what your own glitches are and deal with those.
But what I said to Doug would apply to all of us. Principle is principle, devoid of personality. So as instructors, you go inside and you think to yourself, what needs to be discussed today? And you write that material down because you know that needs to be discussed. And it has nothing to do with personalities involved. If the personalities are involved, then it's all the more reason that the thing had been discussed, but it wasn't discussed individually to them. One day I had about 20 people come up and said, boy, you're talking right to me, weren't you? I said, yes. Because I was talking to everybody, because the principles are eternal in their nature, and they're all inclusive for all of us. There's no question about that. We're all involved in the same basic patterns, the same things that will affect one person around creation, around reality, around communication, around love, around all these things. It applies to all of us, and we can't exclude ourselves. We're all in the same boat together. So much could be said there.